On Valentine's Day, 1981, a 12-year-old boy named Todd Domboski almost disappeared into the United States of America. Not metaphorically, literally. The ground opened beneath his feet in his grandmother's backyard, and he fell. The fire that had opened that hole had already been burning for 19 years. It would burn for another 45. It may burn for another 250. This is the story of how an American town vanished in slow motion, and the handful of people who refused to leave with it. This is Centralia, Pennsylvania. In 1962, it was home to roughly 2,700 people. A Lithuanian church, 4 bars, 2 schools, and 7 coal mines that had been feeding the country since the Civil War. By 2020, the United States Postal Service had revoked its zip code. Its streets had been ripped up. Its buildings had been bulldozed. Its name had been scrubbed from official maps. And somewhere underneath the empty grid where it used to stand, a fire is still burning. Centralia sat at the bottom of a shallow valley in Columbia County, about 80 miles northwest of Philadelphia. It was a hard place. The people who built it were the children and grandchildren of Lithuanian, Irish, Polish, and Ukrainian immigrants who came to dig anthracite, the hardest, blackest, cleanest burning coal in America. By the early 1960s, the town had already been declining for a generation. The mines were shutting down. The young people were leaving. But Centralia still had its parade. It had its volunteer fire department. It had St. Ignatius Roman Catholic Church up on the hill. It had a man named Joseph Tigay, who ran the funeral home, and another named Tom Larkin, who ran the post office. It was, by every account, a quiet place. In May of 1962, the town council met to plan the annual Memorial Day cleanup. The borough's landfill, an abandoned strip mine pit on the southern edge of town, had filled up with trash, and the town needed it cleaned out before the holiday parade rolled through. The standard practice in those days was to burn it. 5 members of the volunteer fire department were assigned to the job. They lit the pile on the morning of May 27, 1962. They watched it. They sprayed it down with water at the end of the day. They went home. And then, somewhere beneath the floor of the pit, the fire kept going. What nobody had accounted for was that the landfill was sitting directly on top of an exposed seam of anthracite coal. That seam connected, underground, to a labyrinth of abandoned mine tunnels that stretched for miles in every direction. Galleries that had been carved out over a century of digging and then sealed up and forgotten when the mines closed. When the surface fire reached the coal seam, the coal began to burn. And coal, once it catches, does not stop. A few weeks after the parade, residents began to notice things. The ground above the landfill was warm. Then it was hot. Steam rose from cracks in the soil where there had been no cracks before. A local mine inspector named Clarence Kashner inspected the site in August and reported that the fire had not been extinguished and was moving underground. The state of Pennsylvania sent in crews. They dug trenches. They flushed the seam with water. They tried to suffocate the fire with ash. None of it worked. By the end of 1962, the fire had spread under several acres. The state estimated the cost of fully extinguishing it at around $750,000 in modern terms. They debated, they argued, they stalled. In 1963, they tried again. They failed again. In 1965, again. By 1969, the fire was burning under more than 200 acres, and the state of Pennsylvania quietly stopped trying. For most of the next 12 years, The residents of Centralia lived on top of a slow-motion disaster that almost nobody outside the town was paying attention to. You have to picture this. Picture going to bed in your house. Picture waking up and finding that the snow in your yard has melted in perfect circles, where there is no snow on either side of the fence. Picture your garden tomatoes ripening in February. Picture coming home and the floor of your basement is warm to the touch. Some residents reported headaches that wouldn't go away. Some reported dizziness. A few collapsed without warning. The cause, they later learned, was carbon monoxide, colorless, odorless, seeping up through the soil from the burning coal beneath. The town was, by the late 1970s, divided. Some residents wanted out. They wanted the government to buy their homes so they could leave. Others, and this is the strange American truth, wanted to stay. This was their town. Their grandparents were buried up at St. Ignatius Cemetery. They had no intention of being chased off their own land by a problem that, from the surface, you mostly couldn't see. And then came Valentine's Day, 1981. Todd Domboski was 12 years old. He was visiting his grandmother's house on a Saturday afternoon. The yard was a small patch of grass on a residential block on the north side of Centralia, a part of town that, officially, was not considered to be on top of the fire. He was, by his own later account, walking with a cousin to look at a smoldering patch of ground near the family clothesline, when the earth opened. There was no warning. There was no rumble. The grass beneath his feet simply gave way, and Todd Domboski dropped, straight down, into a hole that turned out to be about 150 feet deep. He should have died. He didn't, because as he fell, he reached out and caught hold of a tree root that was protruding from the wall of the sinkhole. He hung there, in the dark, 90 feet beneath the surface of his grandmother's lawn, while invisible carbon monoxide and steam rose around him from a fire he could not see. His cousin, Eric Wolfgang, 14 years old, ran for help. A neighbor, a man named John Coddington, who happened to be the borough's gas station owner, was the first adult to arrive. He saw the hole. He saw the boy. He hauled Todd Domboski out by his arms before the carbon monoxide could finish what gravity had started. By the time Todd was at the hospital, the story was already on the wire. For the first time, the country looked at Centralia. In 1984, 2 years after the Domboski incident, the United States Congress appropriated $42 million for a voluntary federal buyout of Centralia. The deal was simple. The government would buy your house at fair market value. You would take the money. You would leave. Most people took the deal. They watched bulldozers come in and flatten the homes their grandparents had built. They watched the church close. They watched the schools close. They watched the post office close. By 1992, the state of Pennsylvania invoked eminent domain on the houses of the holdouts who had refused to sell, declaring the entire borough condemned. In 2002, the Postal Service revoked the zip code 17927 that had identified Centralia for over a century. In 2013, the last remaining residents reached a settlement with the state. 7 of them were allowed to stay in their homes on the explicit condition that those homes would revert to the state upon their deaths. There would be no inheritors of Centralia. There would be no next generation. If you drive to Centralia today, you will not see a town. You will see a grid of empty streets, paved roads laid out in a pattern that has no buildings to organize. You will see one church, St. Cyril and Methodius, up on the hill, still active, still holding services on Sunday, for a congregation that drives in from elsewhere. You will see a cemetery. You will see, if you know where to look, vents in the soil that release a faint shimmer of heat into cold air, and patches of bare earth where the temperature underneath has killed the roots of every plant that has tried to grow there. And you will see, on what is left of Locust Avenue, a handful of houses, fewer every year, where the last residents of Centralia still live. Mary Lou Gorgon, John Lokitis Jr., a small, stubborn community of people who decided somewhere along the way that the fire was not going to take their lives, even if it had taken their town. The most recent estimate from the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection suggests that the underground fire still covers about 400 acres and may continue burning for another 250 years. That is, almost certainly, longer than anyone alive today will live to see. Centralia is not a horror story. It is a quieter thing than that. It is a story about how a country can lose a town, not to a war, not to a flood, not to a single dramatic moment, but to a slow, patient flame that no one chose, no one wanted, and no one could put out. If you are still here with me, thank you for listening. I'm going to keep telling these, the ones that the maps forgot. If you'd like the next one, you know what to do.